the finest hotel in the world, with the finest reception, the finest service, better than anything you've experienced anywhere.
Somewhere at sea, a liner is somewhere at sea.
The finest ship that's ever sailed the Atlantic Ocean, and I think ever likely to have sailed.
That ship had class, such as I've never seen on any other ship.
If you were on Cunard, you couldn't go no higher. That was the best.
People really have a connection with her.
No longer a number on the books, but a ship with a name.
Hearts will glow with admiration.
People know of the Queen Mary even if they don't know of Cunard. You know, they know of her. She's so iconic.
It's a ship that you literally fell in love with.
I'm glad that I was there. I was part of it.
British labour gave it skill.
And I call it the soul. It had a soul.
And we watched her go all down round the Isle of Wight, down past Portsmouth, out into the Channel, and that's where the last time we saw her.
She will always be Southampton's queen.
The Queen Mary.
RMS Queen Mary, the pride of the Cunard fleet and the pride of the nation. After 31 years crossing the Atlantic, she set sail from Southampton on October the 31st, 1967. She would never return. This is the story of Britain's greatest liner and a queen's final farewell. But her life story was not always a happy one.
In the 1920s, Cunard was up against increased competition on the North Atlantic, mainly from the French and German lines. They needed to update their ageing fleet.
Sian Wilkes is the Cunard archivist based at the University of Liverpool.
The three main ships were the Mauretania, Aquitania and Berengaria, and although they were iconic ships in themselves, they were ageing, and Cunard needed to attract this luxury passenger that was going elsewhere.
The ball was in Cunard's court.
They would have to build a ship longer, bigger and faster than any vessel ever built before.
Kenneth Moore, from the BBC South programme marking the end of Queen Mary's cruising life in 1967.
And later there would have to be a sister ship. This way they could scoop the jackpot with a weekly Atlantic service that no other nation could equal.
Designs for a new liner were drawn up. Ships of unprecedented size and speed would, of course, attract passengers with new money.
At the end of 1930, the keel was laid on Clydebank. They called it, simply, the 534.
Hull number 534 was to be the saviour of the Cunard Company. But after just a year under construction at the John Brown shipyard, disaster. The Great Depression.
Cities all across Britain were involved in the construction of her fittings and, building the materials that would go into the Queen Mary. So, you've got Sheffield, Liverpool, Stoke-on-Trent, all these people were unemployed as well. It truly was a national effort to build the Queen Mary. So when this was stopped, it was a crisis for Britain.
Thousands of men were laid off, and the body of 534, already towering above the houses in Glasgow, was left to rust. The same houses where the men who had been building her were living. News came that the French were ahead of the game. In October 1932, SS Normandy was launched.
The ship was embellished with works of art and was considered in itself the supreme expression of the genius of France.
Alexander Scalby describes a record-breaking French liner for the 1979 BBC One programme, Superliners.
The sea had never witnessed such a palatial liner. She boasted a
On her maiden voyage in 1935, SS Normandy broke all existing Atlantic records.
And no less than 23 elevators. The Normandy would immediately capture the cream of the transatlantic trade.
Britain had to regain the waves, and soon.
The British government eventually got involved after construction had stopped for over 2 years. A loan was given so that they could complete the construction of the Queen Mary and in the future her sister ship that would become the Queen Elizabeth. In doing so, it did save 2 British companies that were on the verge of collapse.
The caveat to the loan was the formation of the Cunard White Sow Company.
Soon to be launched from the Clydebank dockyard where she has lain so long, the mighty Cunard of 534 is at last taking on the semblance of the miracle luxury liner.
Newsreel reports from the time capture the final construction before launch.
She still prefers to remain anonymous, and the popular game of the moment is speculating on the name that will eventually be given her. Soon, Gaumont British News will be showing you the amazing pictures of the launch of 534, pictures that will undoubtedly be rated among the wonders of the 20th century.
Her name was still a secret. King George and Queen Mary stood at the lectern to name the great new ship.
As a sailor, I have deep pleasure in coming here today to watch the launching by the Queen of this great and beautiful ship. And today we can send her forth, no longer a number on the books, but a ship with a name in the world, alive with beauty, energy, and strength.
I am happy to name this ship the Queen Mary. I wish success to her and to all to sail in her.
She now had a name, the Queen Mary. For the first time, she was afloat.
Oh, so beautiful. Queen Mary is away. Loads of men up in the forecastle waving to her, slipping into the water. A terrific sight.
And she was impressive, as Pathé noted in their 1934 newsreel.
Just look at the giant 534 and see some of the things that make her the wonder ship of the age. She represents the supreme triumph of marine architecture and engineering. Let us give you some idea of her size. The Thames at Tower Bridge is 940 feet wide, nearly 100 feet less than the length of this colossal ship, which overall measures 1,018 feet. The Houses of Parliament would be completely hidden were it possible to put this monster liner in front of them. The hull and machinery will weigh 50,000 tons, and no less than 10 million rivets have already been used as fastenings in the hull structure. Her four main turbines of 200,000 horsepower will revolve four 35-ton bronze propellers. From keel to superstructure, she measures 135 feet. For the thousands of persons she will carry, there are 12 decks. This is the boat deck. Every safety device that human ingenuity has yet invented will ensure their safety. This is 534, the pride of the Clyde, which is in the background, and in whose waters she'll receive her baptism ere she goes out to make more world history.
Never before had a ship of this size been built. She captured the imagination of the country. Cunard's archivist, Sean Wilkes, again.
We're talking like 200,000 people. It would have made the front pages of all the newspapers across the country. And in doing so, you know, she sort of built that link with the nation, with royalty, and, you know, it just went on from there. She sort of stole the heart of the nation.
In order to get her to open waters, she first had to be navigated out of the shipyard and along the River Clyde. As you would expect, Pathé News was there to report.
The tugs are slowly moving the Queen Mary away from the fitting-out basin, at the start of the most momentous, the most venturesome, and certainly the most ticklish voyage of her whole career. Between this point and the sea lies 15 twisting miles of the River Clyde, with a centre channel so narrow that if she swings more than a few yards off her course, she'll strike the mud banks, and so shallow that at some points there'll be less than 10 feet between her keel and the river bed. And as if all that isn't enough, there are 3 difficult bends to tax even further the navigational skill of the men in command on the bridge, the 2 pilots and Sir Edgar Britton, the Commodore of the Cunard White Star Line. And now at last her nose is pointing westwards, and slowly she moves forward to bid goodbye to her birthplace, with planes roaring overhead and sirens sounding, and close on 1 million people lining the route.
What a sight she would have been, slowly easing herself along the Clyde.
Round the Dalmuir bend, speed is reduced to less than walking pace, and the tugs, like tiny smoke-puffing gnats, push and pull the 80,000-ton hull into position.
Once into open waters, her 4 42,000-horsepower engines, 50 times more powerful than Flying Scotsman's, were fired up.
She will not pass this way again, but to thousands of Scotsmen she will be a thing of pride forever.
You're listening to A Queen's Final Farewell, a special programme to mark half a century since RMS Queen Mary last sailed from Southampton.
After a triumphal journey down the west coast of Britain, the Queen Mary arrives at Southampton, and once more the tugs take her in hand. and everyone who sees her agrees that she's the smartest and most up-to-date ship that has ever been seen in the docks, or nearly the most up-to-date.
She arrived into her home port of Southampton in March 1936.
Hundreds of people line the shore to welcome the liner to the harbour which will now become her home. Some pessimists doubted the possibility of manoeuvring the 80,000-ton giant through the narrow dock gates without a hitch. But with tugs pushing from the outside and teams of men dealing with the hawsers as they're cast ashore, she moves slowly forward.
The 1,020-foot liner dominated Southampton's skyline for 2 months. She boasted 3 classes of cabins, an opulent first-class dining room, cocktail bars, a stage for music, 2 indoor swimming pools, a squash court, a telephone connection, and a small hospital.
At the London terminus, passengers took train for Southampton to embark upon the most memorable voyage in the history of Britain's merchant navy. For after many years of preparation, after the finest brains and labour in the shipbuilding world have brought to perfection the £4,800,000 ocean wonder, the great day has arrived for the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary, bound for New York and the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. Good luck, the Queen Mary.
Hearts will glow with admiration when our new liner leaves the quay, and a name loved by the nation will give her charm and dignity. British labor gave its skill, and it's giving me a thrill, for I'm happy and gay 'cause I'm sailing away. I booked my trip for the USA on the finest ship in the world, the Queen Mary. How'd you like to come with me? The ship is all British, it's wonderful too. The ship is manned by a British crew, so when I go over the sea, the Queen Mary takes me.
And so, at 4:33 on the 27th of May, 1936, the flagship of the Cunard White Star Line set sail on her maiden voyage.
Half ahead all engines. Half ahead all engines.
Everybody was out to work hard, and nearly every man aboard that ship was really a diplomat.
All the public rooms were all bubbling with excitement all the time. Beautiful dresses, everybody dressed up for the occasion. Wine flowed and drinks were all flowing all the time. It was just a hectic voyage, very, very beautiful. Every room was full, and the gaiety, was really something. All the different cabarets and artists we had, and of course the biggest attraction was Henry Hall and his orchestra.
We started off in lovely weather, and the full passenger accommodation was crowded right through, 800 first-class people.
Tom Brewer was a waiter on that historic maiden voyage.
Well, that concludes the program of dance music played to you by the BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye, and here's to the next time.
Right from the start, people were desperate to board Queen Mary, no matter what the cost, if any.
The Queen Mary was about to make its maiden voyage.
Musician Larry Adler, speaking to BBC Radio Solent in 1984.
I had a nightclub engagement in New York, and I wanted to get on that. I mean, I've always been a pretty good self-publicist, as you'll find out during the course of this interview, and I wanted to be on it. However, they were full. And when I approached Cunard, they said, well, we can let you on the ship if you will do a few shows for us. So what we did, Henry Hall and his orchestra were on the ship, and I had broadcast previously with Henry over the BBC. We arranged to do a broadcast from Mid-Atlantic, which would be beamed at both the United States and England. And I was going to play the Rhapsody in Blue. The producer of the program had a name which I will never forget, and once you hear it, I doubt you will either. Caesar Searchinger. Now, that is quite a name. Now, Caesar Searchinger balanced the music, balanced the sound, gave us the signal, and we went into Rhapsody in Blue. When we finished it, Mr. Searchinger came into the ballroom where we were playing and said, I'm sorry, fellas, you weren't on the air. I said, what happened? He said, something went wrong and it didn't go out. I said, well, when did you find out that something was wrong? He said, about 10 seconds after you started. I said, well, why the hell didn't you stop us? He says, I like Rhapsody in Blue. So he let us play the whole damn thing because he liked it. I'll tell you something about that ship. That ship had, well, the American word, and it's a damn good word, class. Such as I've never seen on any other ship. The paneling, the decor was very rich and very good. And the staff, although it was a brand new ship, that staff was a very professional staff. I loved that ship. I was on it several other times. I was also on the Normandy when it made its record crossing across the Atlantic. And I've been on the QE2, as I say, and other ships. But the Queen Mary had something special about it. You almost felt it had an old tradition, even though it was a new ship.
She would carry not just the rich and the famous, but the richest and the most famous. Singer Rosemary Squires.
I rubbed shoulders with Victor Mature, the American film star, Desi Arnaz, who was married to Lucille Ball, and Gracie Fields. Had my photograph taken with her, and she was a great lady. And we got her up to sing with the band a couple of songs. And she had a smashing pair of legs as well.
And the crew mingled with the names.
People like Noel Coward and that were never off the ship. They were always on it. Spencer Tracy and people, you could go on for hours and hours. Bing Crosby, you know. I used to walk around the decks with no wig on. It was sort of funny to see him like that, you know, and he'd just say, good morning, Bing, you know, he'd say, good morning, fellas. But he didn't worry about it on the ship.
You got to accentuate the positive feeling. Minus to negative, latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In-Between.
The ship epitomized style and glamour.
Glamour from beginning to end. Everybody dressed wonderfully. Casuals were smart casuals. No jeans or sneakers or, you know, trainers. It was great.
And once on board, the Holy Grail was dining at the top table.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Hope I see you in good health tonight. And I hope good appetite.
Her 22nd and final captain was John Treasure Jones.
The social side was a very important part of your job on these liners, because the whole idea, the people used to like to meet the captain and have a chat with him, and it was a great publicity stunt in a way. And if they got to know the captain, well, there was a better chance than, if they liked him, of them coming back again in the same ship and in the same company. In fact, I had many passengers who only traveled with me in whatever ship I was in.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the Americans were waiting.
Here she comes, England's pride and the glory of her merchant marine, the brand new $50 million Queen Mary. The Paramount News plane, with the veteran ace Charlie Stoffer at the controls and Urban Santone at the camera, is first to greet the great liner, still 50 miles at sea. It's only a little after dawn, and the Queen Mary is cracking down at 33 knots, the top speed of her voyage across. She didn't break the Normandy record, but the officers say they didn't think it wise to open up her engines full. Anytime they want, so the Englishmen say, they can take that record away. But today belongs to the Queen Mary. She is the guest of New York.
Paramount Newsreel captured Queen Mary's maiden arrival into New York, an event making news in the UK too.
Despite the disappointment over the record, New York went crazy on the arrival of Britain's wonder ship. Skyscrapers, streets on the waterfront, vacant plots of ground, every available vantage point was black with people, making a holiday to welcome the Queen Mary.
The coming of the Queen Mary inaugurates one of the greatest races of all time. Which ship will turn out to be the faster, the Normandy or the Queen? That is the question of the hour. Here is Commodore Sir Edgar Britton.
Our speed came up above our expectations, and everybody was very pleased with what the ship did.
Are you going to try for the blue ribbon, Captain?
Well, naturally, that's what we're out for. What did we build her for?
It would take more Atlantic crossings for her engines to be ready for a record attempt. She claimed the coveted blue ribbon with an average westbound speed of 30.14 knots. And on her eastbound return, she averaged 30.63 knots, claiming both titles.
Champagne flowed like water.
Anyone who was anyone would travel on the Mary.
Some of the nice people I handled quite a few times, and
Marlene Dietrich in those days in the 30s, Herbert Wilcox before he married Anne, J.P. Morgan, Churchill. Just look after them all. I tell you, a nice old fella, all Rachmaninoff, the pianist. Always put a soft pedal piano in his suite, in his room.
She really was a liner fit for a queen, and all royalty.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were practically like commuters, going back and forth from their chateau in France to the Waldorf Towers in New York.
Everett Horde is Queen Mary's current Commodore, based in Long Beach.
Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, traveled in November of 1954. She went westbound in her namesake, the Queen Elizabeth, and came home in the Queen Mary.
Luxury for the passengers, but for the crew, conditions were more basic.
The cabin class waiter's room on the Queen Mary, remember that in the alleyway?
That's right. Yeah.
Right over the boiler room. 14 men in that room. And it was right over, directly above a big boiler, you know. So the heat in there was phenomenal. And they had air blowers in the room all the time, but you couldn't combat the heat that was coming through the floor, you know.
The crew's memories of Queen Mary's early crossings.
And you take your shoes off at night and they curl up like Egyptian sandals, you know. You have a curl on the end of your foot.
Ruth Powell's father, Doug, was a waiter on the Mary.
Well, I know he said about the working alleyway, you know, it's very noisy, very sort of smelly. The stabilisers as well. The Mary wasn't very good in rough seas.
She was always assured a warm welcome into New York. Keith Lloyd is now the chairman of the Queen Mary Association, but served on board as a waiter.
They used to call it Luxury Liner Row, and they had so many boats. The Queen's, the Mauritania, the Coronia Carmania, there'd be the Italian boats, there'd be the Rex, there'd be the Normandy before she burnt down. And that whole section of the docks on the Hudson was unbelievable. Busy, hectic, people coming in, people going, people were hustling each other, and it was great, it was great. And I'm glad that I was there, I was part of it.
For 3 years, she carried thousands of passengers across the North Atlantic. But hostilities in Europe meant her days as luxury liner were cut short. Her final crossing to New York was completed with blacked-out portholes. She stayed in New York for 6 months. In 1940, she was sent to Sydney to be refitted as a troopship and dressed in grey. Robert Wall takes up the story.
Queen Elizabeth followed, and both ships carried Anzac troops to the Middle East for the campaigns that ended Mussolini's African empire.
Normandy had been requisitioned by the US Navy, but was destroyed by fire during her refit in New York. Queens Mary and Elizabeth would traverse the North Atlantic alone, carrying troops to Europe. By the thousand.
This was a situation almost unparalleled in maritime history because for her there was no Navy escort across 3,000 miles of submarine-infested waters to New York. For 6 arduous years she sailed as a troopship, the most expensive troopship ever built, with her decks above and below packed with servicemen.
Designed to carry 2,000 passengers in peacetime, on one wartime crossing, 15,740 troops were on board.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill would travel, we know of, 8 times in the Queen Mary, and 3 of those were during World War II.
Everett Horde again.
He sort of used the Queen Mary as his floating Whitehall, as he sailed across to meetings with President Roosevelt, as well as going to the Quebec conferences. And on a couple of those voyages, he carried his entire war cabinet along. The plans for Operation Overlord were first presented to the Prime Minister in his main deck suite in mid-Atlantic at high speed aboard the Queen Mary.
And it was while she was in service as a troopship that disaster struck.
On October the 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary was running into the Clyde, making 25 knots, at the end of yet another Atlantic crossing.
Robert Wall, once again.
There to meet her and escort her home was the Royal Navy cruiser Curaçao. The 2 ships steamed on together in a routine zigzag, until a slight error placed the cruiser straight across the liner's bow. Queen Mary sliced into the Curaçao, cut her in half and sailed on, leaving 329 dead in her wake.
Queen Mary's officer of the watch was Noel Robinson.
We struck her virtually amidships and cut the ship completely in half. steam and smoke rising from both halves. One half of the cruiser went down the starboard side of the Queen Mary, the other half of the cruiser went down the port side. The actual impact was not even noticed by anyone on the bridge at all. In fact, it was hardly felt by anyone on the ship.
I was standing right here on this rail, and I saw the Curacao come from the stern, and she came quite close to our starboard side here, and at the time we were zigzagging. And then there was a slight impact. I didn't think that we'd hit the ship, but after a few moments, I looked to the port side, and she was in two halves. And I saw men jumping from the forward deck.
101 men were rescued, but 338 lost their lives on Curaçao. You're listening to A Queen's Final Farewell, a special programme to mark half a century since RMS Queen Mary last sailed from Southampton. After the war, she came back to Southampton's King George V dry dock for a 10-month refit. And on July the 31st, 1947, she returned to her intended role. And fare-paying passengers couldn't get back on board quickly enough.
People were sort of knocking on our doors with money in their hands, willing to book 6 months before they wanted to travel. The ships were sailing voyage after voyage, booked to capacity.
And she was joined in 1948 by her sister RMS Queen Elizabeth. Cunard Commander Geoffrey Marr captained both Queens.
In fact, at times we were leaving very annoyed passengers on the quay with tickets in their hands because it was a company policy to overbook 5% for cancellations, but because berths were so difficult to obtain, very few people cancelled.
Everett Horde, Queen Mary's current Commodore, once again.
The two ships were earning what they cost to build every year, which was in the neighborhood of $25 million. And oddly, the Queen Mary was usually the preferred ship, even over the more modern, more streamlined Queen Elizabeth. I think that the Queen Mary's, that natural, insatiable allure that she possesses, made her the favorite in the 1950s.
I often say that the Cunard line had 10 glorious years, because when the two Queens came back on the Atlantic after being refitted after the war, they were the only large passenger ships on the service.
They really were the halcyon days between 1947 and 57. Commodore Marr, he used to say Cunard thought they had found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
2,000 passengers at a time crossing the Atlantic, separated by class.
No, that's the segregation gate, madam.
Well, I don't think you can mix Claridge's and the Regent Palace, can you, really? I suppose you can. But if you're in the Regent Palace, you're in the Regent Palace. If you're in Claridge's, you're in Claridge's.
This first class, tourist class, cabin class.
Beryl Dawson was a first-class stewardess.
They were in good standing. They'd had their own businesses, etc., and reaping the benefit at the end of their life. A lot of them were more mature than I was, so.
A suite for two would set you back over £1,000. Cabin class at the rear of the ship would be around £100. And for under £100, you could have a bunk in a shared tourist cabin at the bow. For those paying the premium, nothing was spared in the welcome. Crew member Richard Noon completed 7 crossings on Queen Mary.
When she was getting ready to sail, all the florists and the bouquets would be delivered, ready for the passengers, and people like myself, if you weren't rested in the restaurant duties, you would be delivering bouquets and various things to various cabins. And I can remember on Ardeck Square, which is the main entrance hall of the restaurant of the first class, they always used to have a cold meat display. And meats like you wouldn't believe were on show there. Not for eating, just for showing people what could be done as they came on board. I can remember one that I do remember was that one of the chefs had made a lobster out of sugar, and it was utterly, utterly fantastic.
While the brochure showed the most glamorous accommodation available, the crew's quarters were still basic. Geoffrey Le Marquand joined Queen Mary in 1957 as a commie waiter.
Well, as you can see, in this cabin there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, but all the toilets were one deck below. And when you got called in the morning at 6 o'clock, obviously everybody gets out their bunk, goes down a deck for a wash and a shave and come back to get ready. In those days, we thought that was good.
And there was 12 of us in there, and no toilets. That was way down the alleyway, you know. It was nothing like you see today's ships.
You accepted it. You didn't know luxury. That's how it was built. You got on board. You never criticised it because there was no alternative.
Despite her size, she didn't always offer a smooth crossing.
She rocked and rolled all the way to New York. If you were on the stern in rough weather, the outer propeller would come out, so you could see her rolling over.
So in 1958, she was dry docked and stabilisers were fitted. The Queens had the North Atlantic to themselves. Now retired to Dallas in Texas, Arthur Bullock is a former Queen Mary engineer.
There was zero shipping in our lanes. We had shipping lanes to ourselves. On clear days, we'd see the Queen Elizabeth. I got photographs of the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary passing in the Atlantic.
The working days for the waiters in first class would be up to 14 hours.
We didn't have sitting.
Richard Noon again.
On first class, it was just 6 p.m. until it finished.
People eating at midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. And when you go to bed, you know, there was one of the adverts, isn't it? Getting there's half the fun.
We were respected to a certain degree, but it was them and us routine in lots of ways. But we were taught such fantastic things. We used to push the smoked salmon trolleys, whole sides of smoked salmon, and we were taught by head waiters, again like Keith Lloyd, how to carve that, where you could put that on a menu and read it through. It was that thin. And you also had hors d'oeuvre trolleys. Anything between 30 and 40 separate hors d'oeuvres, and you would have to know what was the ingredients in each one, because if a passenger asked you, you were expected to know. And the roast beef was carved by the chefs there. It was a different world.
It's a fantastic smell of mothballs, because when you went around the tables, all these women had all the furs on. Never worn them, you see, from one week to the next.
You used to have stars, obviously, plenty of them, and come over, and some would come down, occasionally be allowed to come down to the old crew leisures and the pig and whistle and do a little turn down there. I can remember there was virtually a mini riot when they put the price of beer up to 1 7 pence a pint. And I think they'd put it up from about 1 5 pence.
We used to have horse racing night, gambling, sing songs. If we had any well-known entertainers, they used to be asked to come down and put on a show for the crew. And yeah, it went down well.
Dave Smith was a trainee chef from 1960 to 1963.
You had the first-class kitchen, which served first-class passengers only. I was in cabin class, and you probably had 60, 70 people at a time just looking after the passengers, and they could have what they like.
Paul Chamberlain was a butcher from Woolston.
We used to be in charge of milk, ice cream, cooked meat, the ice for the bars. We had a kosher fridge where we used to put the dead bodies occasionally.
Beryl Dawson again.
Well, you looked after people if they were poorly, if they couldn't get down to the dining room, and some people were too lazy to move anyway. So you used to go and get the food and bring it back down, take them up to the deck if they were wheelchair bound, even take them ashore on trips. I was happy to do anything.
An army of engineers would keep her massive 20-foot propellers turning and the services on board running.
I think it was 95 engineer and electrical officers. And then on top of that, in the boiler rooms, you used to have 2 firemen and 2 trimmers. So there was 5 men in each boiler room over a 24-hour period.
Engineer from 1961 to 1963, Harvey Jones.
You knew from one trip to another what job you were actually going to do. So with 2 engine rooms, 5 boiler rooms, 2 generator rooms, you could be employed on any of those jobs. The boiler rooms used to have 6 boilers in each, and number 2 and number 3 used to steam number 4 and number 5. The boilers in number 4 and number 5 were slightly bigger than the ones in 2 and 4. It used to be over 100 degrees on the plates in the summer and cooler in the winter.
For the crew, visiting New York offered opportunities not readily available to the normal working man or woman in Southampton.
I used to buy nylons in New York for $1, bring them back to Southampton and sell them to the girls in a cafe called The Checkpoint from C&A, B&H, and used to sell them for 10 shillings.
Geoffrey Lemarquand again.
I also bought Wranglers in New York for $2.70, which was £1, bring them back to Southampton and sell them to the lads for £1, 10 shillings, 1.50. They were always stiff and dark blue, so on the homeward voyage I'd hang them in the showers, which would wash the stiffness out and change the colours.
And there were plenty of other sidelines to be had.
A lot of the boy ratings were able to see the first-class chefs and have the finest food, but I have to pay for that, and it would cost you £1 out of your wages each way. Well, if you had half a dozen lads or 10 lads, you would have 20 quid. 20 quid in those days, on top of your wages, worth having.
Except for the occasional Mediterranean cruise, she plied the North Atlantic line non-stop for almost another 20 years.
If she came in on a Monday afternoon, she sailed Thursday afternoon. If she came in early on a Monday, she sailed Thursday morning.
Derek Jordan from Totten was one of Queen Mary's engineers from 1958 to 1961.
We used to leave and then go across to Cherbourg in them days, go alongside in Cherbourg, maybe only 2 hours, and off to New York, and it's the same on the return.
And of course, each time she came home to Southampton, traders braced themselves.
The High Street in Southampton was buzzing.
Dave Smith again.
Because they knew there'd be 1,000-odd crew coming ashore, going up to places like Boots the Chemist, Timothy White's, just buying all the stuff and all that.
And then there were the pubs. Sylvia Mortimer was a publican on Oxford Street.
We were very busy first thing in the morning and lunchtime, but then of course most of the ships sailed early afternoon or evening, so there was no evening trade down there at all. One week we had the Lizzie boys, next week it was the Mary, then it was the other ones, the Samaria and different things like that, you know. It was a different world then.
But the heyday for the liners was numbered. The jet engine allowed for more efficient airliners and therefore more affordable fares. You're listening to A Queen's Final Farewell, a special programme to mark half a century since RMS Queen Mary last sailed from Southampton.
People didn't want to spend 5 days getting to New York. They wanted to spend 5 hours.
Keith Lloyd is chairman of the Queen Mary Association.
The Comet had come in, people were going on that. The price of oil shot up and it became expensive to run.
Dave Smith again.
It's a shame and all that because the passengers had luxury. They could have anything they want. But with business, time is money, and they want to get from London to New York to Southampton as quick as possible.
Everett Horde.
The advent of jet travel was upon the world. And 1957 was the most lucrative year for transatlantic ocean travel. But in 1958, with the reliable air service going back and forth across the Atlantic, numbers began to fall.
But for the younger crew, like Richard Noon, working in first class, the decline in passenger numbers wasn't noticed initially.
It really didn't seem to affect us that much because we were on the Queen Mary, we were this, we were that. We didn't seem to, as boys, didn't take notice, if you like maybe the older crew would have done. Oh, well, there's only 500 or 600 on board, there was 800 last trip. First class, you know, it was all different.
We were aware that passenger numbers weren't the same. Passenger numbers were dropping. In the summer, it wasn't too bad. Cabin class, which I was in, we kept our numbers up pretty well. But first class and tourist class, numbers dropped dramatically. And when I left in 63, I think she was still making a profit then. But 66, 67, that was the decline.
New York was just a matter of hours away now, rather than days. Built specifically for the Atlantic, she was too big and cumbersome to be considered for cruising ports. And her lack of air conditioning meant she would be uncomfortable for passengers in warmer climes. By the middle of the 60s, Queen Mary was losing the Cunard Company £8,000 a day, a figure that was simply unsustainable.
Using 1,000 tons of oil every 24 hours at sea, that's 13 feet to the gallon, or a barrel of oil every 30 seconds, with 1,250 crew looking after only a couple hundred passengers. And so inevitably, it was the end of an era, and Cunard was faced with the unenviable decision to retire their two famous flyers, the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth.
The last captain of Queen Mary was John Treasure Jones.
When Mr. Philip Bates, our managing director, called me down to the office when I was on leave to tell me that they were withdrawing the two queens, I wasn't a bit surprised. When he asked me if I was surprised, I said, no, sir. I said, what I'm surprised about is you haven't withdrawn them before, that we've been losing so much money. So it was not a surprise to me. I could see it coming for quite a long time. Because while I was captain of the Queen Mary those 2 years, there was hardly a voyage, except one or two in the height of the summer, where we made any money. We were losing money all the rest of the time. So it was very obvious to us.
She was put up for sale.
Oh, I think it's awful. I really do. I think it's terrible. A beautiful ship like this, it'll never be duplicated again. Her size, for one thing, how man can conceive in his mind to begin to put together a whole piece of equipment like this to float in the ocean. 100,000 tons of steel and passageways as long as avenues in any city in the world. I think it's a marvelous thing. I really do. And now it's going to end. It's like a passing of an old friend. No country in the world would ever build a ship like this again.
The city of New York wanted to put the Queen Mary on the Hudson River and use her as a floating dorm for high school students. Fortunately, that didn't happen. The city of Philadelphia wanted to use the ship on the Delaware River as a hotel and static attraction, but realized the Delaware was much too shallow to accommodate the ship, and dredging would cost a colossal amount of money. I think my favorite is that the Reverend Billy Graham, a former passenger in the Queen Mary, wanted to buy the ship and use it as a floating Bible college. But it was the city of Long Beach that made the successful offer of $3,450,000 with a stipulation that they could offer a cruise from Southampton to Long Beach, because the city fathers thought that if the ship had arrived in California without passengers, that it would be anticlimactic and a bad omen.
On the 23rd of September 1967, she set sail from New York for her 1001st and final crossing. The occasion captured by British Pathé.
There can be no mistaking the owner of that proud voice. The Queen Mary was on her way home from New York for the last time. It was a voyage that all those fortunate enough to make will never forget. Days and nights of farewell parties that left her passengers to catch up on lost sleep below decks.
The crew reflected on the final voyage.
After this is over, since this has been your home for so many years, what will you do?
Well, we'll find something that
might
be a different ship.
Of course you will. You'll be reassigned.
Well, of course, we're getting on in years now, madam.
Well, yes, but you're
just one of those things.
How you doing?
Very well.
What are you going to do when this thing packs up?
Well, I don't know, Bob. I suppose try and get another one.
Well, you will, unless you want to take the rivets out.
And for the captain, John Treasure Jones, a special duty to perform.
This special bottle of whiskey, which was put on board the Queen Mary on her maiden voyage, has been sent to me by Mr. Francis Rosenbaum, who obviously bought it on the first voyage, on the maiden voyage, the Queen Mary, and has kept it in his cellars ever since. And he thought it appropriate that he should return it to me to give you all a little drink out of it on this final voyage. I hope it hasn't will have too great an effect, as we've still got to get into Southampton yet. So, with that, I think we'll pour a little out and we'll toast Mr. Rosenthal. Well, that ice melted quickly. That ice melted almost in one go. This must be great stuff. Well, come on, grab yourselves a drink. Very good. I have plenty of water in mine, and it's beautiful. That's well liqueur whiskey, that's right.
And so she headed peacefully for port. On the bridge, a proud time for the men bringing her to the welcome she so rightly deserved. The grand old ship as they had so many times before. But this time it was different, because this was her 1001st Atlantic crossing. It was also her last. How splendidly they saluted her. Gently, she came alongside the quay, which throughout her career has been her British home. There was no doubting the enormous pride everyone on shore and aboard felt for her. She was and will remain a triumph of British shipbuilding. And so the crowds cheered, the streamers flew, and the sirens blasted. One more cruise was ahead of her, and then a well-earned retirement. The Atlantic reign of a queen had come to an end.
For the people of Southampton, a final chance to see the Queen in port.
Lots of tears, lots of sadness, thinking, well, it's coming to an end now.
But it's life, isn't it? I suppose she'd had her life. And we were lucky that America took her on, because look what happened to the Queen Elizabeth.
The day that she sailed, I wanted to go down to the pier and see her go out. But I was on night duty that night, and so I mean, you just didn't do it in those days. I pulled a sickie, didn't I? I phoned in and said I was sick, so I went down to the pier to see her go off.
Paul Chamberlain's fiancée, Anne Williams.
But there were so many thousands of people down there, you know, you just couldn't see an awful lot.
Obviously, in those days, we had to wait for the tide, because she used to draw about 43 feet of water, which is a lot more than the Queen Mary II does today. In those days, we used to use up to 7 tugs.
On the morning of Tuesday, October the 31st, 1967, she slipped her lines at 103 berth in Southampton for the last time.
Let go the chail forward.
British Pathé.
Let go the chail forward.
Let go forward. Hard starboard. Half ahead all engines. Half ahead all engines.
This really was it. The day had at last come when the Queen Mary was leaving home for good. But Southampton wasn't going to let the grand old ship just slip away without a proper send-off.
We could see the boat, the sirens went, and as she come out, the noise on the beach was deafening. People at Western Shore were cheering, some were crying, because we knew this would be the last time we'd see her.
On board were over 1,000 passengers for the last voyage. And as the liner moved out, helicopters of the Royal Navy flew over her in anchor formation.
All the dockside cranes lowered their jibs, so in salute to the Queen.
Majestically, she slid out into Southampton water. This was the moment of final farewell.
All the port workers, office workers, the shops come to a standstill, because everybody was on rooftops, on the quay, just watching the Queen go.
From the people of the land of her birth, and from the Royal Navy came the final honour for the greatest merchant ship ever built. The Queen Mary had sailed from Britain, never again to return.
For steward George Simmons from Portsmouth, Queen Mary's final voyage was his first.
We were coming out of Southampton. I was because you can look out of the portos and see that, and all hundreds of ships. I mean, that is a magnificent moment in time.
All the Western Shore, there were loads of people.
Hythe Pier was chock-a-block and off of Cowshot and Leap.
Southampton water was filled with craft of all shapes and sizes.
Too many to count. Loads and loads and loads.
And the flotilla of the helicopters, small aircraft, was fantastic.
When she goes down and turns off a Cowshot and then swings around to the Isle of Wight, that's when she starts to speed up, and that's when we all turn around and go home.
Down past Portsmouth, out into the Channel, and that's where the last time we saw her.
The captain on the final voyage was John Treasure Jones, and he described Queen Mary's departure as the greatest farewell any ship has ever had.
Sian Wilkes, Cunard archivist again.
In the Cunard archive, we've got a copy of the Southern Evening Echo. Its headline on the front page is "So it's farewell, old lady." So it's this tonal language that they're using to describe her. You know, it's quite a fond way of talking about her. As she pulled away, there's a squadron of naval helicopters, and they were in anchor formation. You've also got the Royal Marine Band that was playing music, and that really would have, built up the atmosphere with the crowds. And there was a fleet of, smaller ships and tugs that escorted her on her way. Perhaps most famously HMS Hermes, the aircraft carrier, and of course their crew lined up and waved her off as well.
The BBC was on board that final voyage and asked Captain Treasure Jones to record his thoughts.
Well, now it's very difficult to say what it's been like. It's my life ambition. I always wanted to command a ship like this, and I couldn't have had a better ship. It's the finest ship that's ever sailed the Atlantic Ocean, and I think ever likely to have sailed. And I'm privileged and proud to have had this command and have had such a very fine crew with me.
Leaving Southampton behind, Queen Mary's final voyage took her to Lisbon, Las Palmas, and then into Rio de Janeiro. George Simmons, once again.
Down around the Horn, which was the first time the Mary had been round the Horn, and it was like a mill pond. And then we went up the west coast. That was when we stopped, I think it was at Acapulco up the west coast, and then up to Long Beach. At the age I was there, I didn't notice any sadness. Yes, a lot of the fellas have been on the ship, and it was the last, been on there many years, and it was the last trip. I suppose, thinking about it now, if it was my last trip now at the age I am now, yes, you've been on it a long time and you would be disappointed.
On arrival into Long Beach on December the 9th, she was met by an armada of craft. Captain John Treasure Jones again.
It was a fascinating entry. It was almost like a wonderland in a way, because here was this vast ocean of sea covered with small boats from about 20 miles south of Long Beach all the way up to Long Beach, and they kept following me as best they could. I reduced speed, but never in my life have I seen so many boats on the water at the same time. They're so massed together. It was really a sight.
Oh, it's fantastic with all the Yankees. You couldn't move for people. Really emotional, I think.
Captain Treasure Jones had brought the ship in within 2 miles so that everyone along the shore could get a look at California's latest attraction. But he also realized that there had possibly been some 5,000 boats. But of course, Master Mariner, that John Treasure Jones was, there was no collision between the Queen Mary and any one of the many boats that were celebrating the ship's arrival. And he said he was alongside at around 12 p.m. on the 9th, and at 17 minutes after 12, he would say, "Everett, I went over to the engine room, telegraphs, I rang up finished with engines myself, and I allowed the Queen Mary's great heart to cool forever."
Queen Mary is now a tourist attraction. Since May the 8th, 1971, 15 million people have crossed her gangway. Looked after by 593 crew, she is a hotel, conference and special event venue. She may no longer be an ocean-going liner, but her place in history remains.
She is actually now the very last 1930s superliner to exist, and so in that sense she's very important because there aren't any other examples at all. All the others, such as Normandy, Queen Elizabeth, all her contemporaries have all gone.
David Ellery, speaking to BBC South in 2001. In December, she will host a series of special gala events to mark the 50th anniversary of her arrival into California.
She will always be Southampton's ship. She belongs to you. We really are only her keepers. She will always be Southampton's queen.
Captain John Treasure Jones.
I am indeed delighted that I was associated with these liners. I was proud of them. Couldn't have asked for a better position in my anywhere. I always wanted to be captain of one of these big liners, and I'm proud and lucky and privileged to have been associated with them.
A Queen's Final Farewell contains archive material from BBC News and British Pathé. It was written, researched and produced by Neil Sackley.